Good morning. Kia ora. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay, just checking. Thank you. Yesterday we talked about a changing world for our kids and how we must prepare them for work, for learning, for citizenship, and for active and creative leisure. That's the problem, I think, that we need to solve. But then the question becomes, so what do we do? And I deflected a couple of questions to that effect yesterday, particularly one here about how do we talk to parents, because I really wanted to devote an entire session to the question and the challenge of changed leadership. All right, let me take a little bit of time to share some things I've learned, some of which I've learned the hard way. I was a miserable principal. Miserable. Failure. I'm serious. I took the job much too young, age of 33, with no primary experience. I came straight from a secondary classroom to a primary school, K-8 school, primary intermediate school. And I made lots of mistakes, and I've just finished writing a memoir about them, as a matter of fact. So you'll have to stay tuned for that. But what those mistakes taught me above anything else was to really try to understand how I could have been more successful. So many years later, fast forward, I'm in my doctorate at Harvard studying how schools change. And that's what I wrote a dissertation on. I studied 3 schools, secondary schools, in the process of change over a year and a half. Wrote my first book called, in fact, How Schools Change. Then years after that, I became involved with the Gates Foundation very, very early on when they first began making grants in education, before they started really screwing things up. That's another longer conversation. But we very quickly realized, as we kind of scanned the horizon, that, you know, if you're in business and you're having a problem, you can call up any number of consulting firms, Deloitte, McKinsey, any number of them. But if you're in education and you got a problem, who do you call? There isn't anybody. Yeah, right. Yeah. Hello, hello, anybody there? Yeah, they don't give you that phone number in the training, do they? So we began a center at Harvard called the Change Leadership Group. And we spent a decade studying effective change leadership, as well as working with teams of change leaders from a wide variety of schools all over the country. And we wrote a book together about it called Change Leadership. It's still around, it's still available, and much of what I will talk about today draws from that book, not the later books from which I drew yesterday's talks, Creating Innovators and the Global Achievement Gap. So, with due apologies to Stephen Covey, sort of adapted his idea, the 7 habits of highly successful people or something, 7 habits of effective change leaders. The first thing I came to understand is that we have a misconception of what effective leadership really is and does. And that's fueled by expectations. The expectation is if you're a leader, you got more answers than somebody who's a mere follower, right? That's why they made you a leader. You have more answers. Problem is, in education, we're afflicted with a disease I call answeritis. And so the idea that we as leaders should have more answers than other people, I think, does everybody a serious disservice. And worse than that, what I have seen over and over again is reform du jour, fad of the month, right? When I was a teacher, oh, it was always somebody getting up there in September with some hot new idea. You know, and then talking to teachers, they say, please don't let my principal go to another conference, because she's going to come back with 10 new ideas. That whole challenge of leadership, I think, is less about offering answers than framing the right questions. The formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. It's my favorite quote from Einstein. And I think it sums up the real challenge of change leadership. It's not to offer answers, but to frame the right challenges, the right questions, and to create understanding and urgency for change. That's the biggest job. And understanding and urgency is head and heart, as somebody mentioned today. Understanding is an intellectual understanding. Urgency is an emotional sense. At some very fundamental level, we as educators are a part of a very risk-averse culture. And so much of the national standards movements around the world and all of the testing around the world has only made that problem worse. We are highly risk-averse. And so it is natural for people, even under normal circumstances, not to want to change. Why should they take a risk? So our job is to help people understand there are more risks in not changing for our kids than there are in changing. It's a risk-benefit analysis we have to help people understand. That's what I was trying to do yesterday. Help all of us better understand this world and what's at stake for our kids if we do not change. So we have to give people a sense of urgency, a sense of reasons for needing to change on behalf of kids, and help them understand the risks to kids if we don't change. So that gets me to the next challenge here. Often I hear leaders talking about, oh, I need buy-in, I need my people to buy in, I need them to get on the bus. Let's talk about ownership. Oh, I have all these stakeholders. Let's talk about shareholders. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a recovering high school English teacher, so language matters to me. And language matters in how we frame the challenge. The challenge is to create ownership for change. Understanding and urgency for change is about ownership, not selling people your solution. That's how leadership is conventionally defined. I got this new idea at this great conference, I'm doing this mandate from the top, I'm going to sell this solution and get buy-in. No. The challenge is to create ownership. And we do that, I think, by asking the right questions and providing the right evidence. So much in education we talk about being data-driven, not evidence-based. What's the difference? Data is all about numbers. Numbers are cold. Numbers are important. But they don't create urgency for change. Data does not create the heart in the change process. That's different. So we need it. We need the data. We need data about dropout rates. We need data about employment rates. We need data about attainment rates. Absolutely important. Far more important than test score data, by the way, are the real data from kids' lives. How many go on to succeed in secondary? How many in post-secondary? What are the attainment data? What about the employment data? But that data has to be supplemented with qualitative evidence, listening to voices. So one of the things that I've done in many, many places where I've worked to help facilitate a change process is lead focus groups with students and or focus groups with recent graduates and videotape them with permission, of course. But when you start asking a student, what are the strengths of our school? They list them in a focus group context, 10 or 12 kids. What are the things that need improving, having to do with learning? So we discount lunch, right? What are the things that need improving related to learning? What are one or two things that could be changed that would make the greatest difference in your life as a learner? What is good teaching? Students will describe what is a good teacher. Then you give them a math question. Then you say, of all of the academic teachers you've had here in the last X years, 3, whatever, how many, without naming names, very, very important. This is not a game of gotcha. You ask students, how many were good teachers by your own criteria, which I just wrote down on the board, from you? A good school, you might get 50%. It's shocking. But that's evidence for the heart when you play it back to parents and teachers. That's what I'm talking about when I'm suggesting evidence. Asking recent graduates, even better. I know one principal of a primary school who would do an exit interview with every single one of his leaving sixth graders, asking those questions more personally at the end of his or her experience in 5, 6 years of the school. So we need to help people understand the real experience of kids. At the same time, we need to help them understand what's going out there in the real world. Talk about engaging parents. How many parents really understand some of the things I tried to talk about yesterday? The nature of the innovation era, the expectations of kids, in terms of how they have to be differently prepared, willingness to take risks, willingness to collaborate, the importance of effective communication and teamwork. Over and over again, that's what business leaders say is lacking from our graduates from every level. But parents don't hear that. So our job is to bridge that conversation gap, again, with evidence. Bring those employers to your school or videotape them in their workplaces and bring the videotapes in. Have a panel discussion for a PTA night. The changing expectations for employers and for continuing education. Our job then is to help our shareholders, our parents and our teachers, hear the voices they don't customarily hear. The voices of our students and the voices of the larger community to which we are ultimately accountable and to which our students will go for work and further learning. We have to bridge that gap. That's what I mean by bringing evidence to our shareholders as opposed to buy-in for our programs. It's a very, very different job. And invariably, there's going to be trial and error. Give us a couple of examples. I was in a large school district, 75,000 students. They were asking the question, what does it mean to be a graduate of our school? And that's very often the very first thing to try to do is define what does a graduate from our school need to know and be able to do? Then you bring in the evidence to begin to answer that question. That's what they did. This district, they did interviews with employers, videotaped them. They did interviews with recent graduates. This is very key. You ask your recent graduates, in what ways, recent meaning 3 to 5 years out. And they can be graduates from your primary school. I'm not just talking about secondary graduates. Asking them, in what ways were you most well prepared for the next step that you took? In what ways were you least well prepared? What's one thing we could have and should have done better? What would be your advice to teachers if you were to go back? What would be your advice to parents if you were to go back? Not your parents, the parents. And again, you videotape that conversation and you bring it back. You don't bring a summary back, you bring back the tape. And again, you're problematizing as opposed to answering the question. You're framing the challenge with the nature of the evidence that you bring for people's consideration. So this district did that. They had previously asked everybody kind of what are the highest priorities for this school district for our graduates. People listed 40 things, 40 things. They got everybody in a room. Now, you guys don't have school districts, so you can do this much more easily than this group did. They had to hire the Civic Center for 1,000 people. Got them all in the room. 2 hours, they looked at the data, the attainment data I just talked about, percentage of kids graduating, percentage of kids dropping out, percentage of kids succeeding in secondary and post-secondary. They looked at all that data. Then they looked at the focus group videos that this team had prepared. Then they put up the 40 things that everybody said should be important. And you know, the school that has 40 priorities has none. The school that has 10 priorities has none. So they said, okay, I'm giving everybody a clicker. You're going to have time for you to talk at your tables. Then I want you to vote on what you think is most important. Overwhelmingly, 1,000 people voted for two things: teaching students to be self-motivated learners and teaching students to be critical thinkers. What happened was, and I've seen it over and over again, when you give people opportunities to weigh the evidence and to have conversations, community-based conversations, their own adult focus groups, they come to a set of worked-through beliefs that are far more profound and more lasting than top-of-the-head opinions, which you might get in a survey. So that's our challenge, is to help people work through an understanding of why change. Parents, teachers, community members, even students. Then the next challenge, I think, is really, once you've done that, you've got to have the focus on improving learning for kids. And we get distracted with other stuff too often. Outside mandates, competing priorities. But really, if it's not about improving learning, it's not about anything. And that then suggests a different role for us, which is being leaders of instruction. It means getting into classrooms. It means observing and understanding much more deeply what are our teachers challenged with, what are they dealing with, what are some first important steps. So this district I talked about, after they decided critical thinking and self-motivated learning were the most essential outcomes for their graduates, their administrative team spent 1 year observing in classrooms, trying to better understand, well, what is critical thinking? What does it look like in classrooms when it's being done well? What is the evidence in student work? And what are the most important interventions that we might design that would be most helpful to teachers? And they engage teachers in that conversation. Another, on a small scale, secondary principal I knew, brand new to the school, spent most of her time out observing classes. Quick in and out. What some people call learning walks, or opportunities to really better understand the learning that goes on in your classroom. Just 3 to 5 minutes in and out of a classroom. And she was looking for patterns. She was not looking to evaluate individual teachers. She was looking for patterns. And she, lo and behold, saw a very clear pattern across many, many of her classes. The quality of questions being asked by teachers and the quickness of the responses from students. Most of the questions being asked were guess what's on the teacher's mind kinds of questions. Questions that the teacher already knew the answer to. And the answers were always from the kids in the front, right? First one to raise his or her hand, gets called on, boom, on to the next guess what's on my mind question. That was the pattern she saw. And this is not about blame. This is not about gotcha. This is not about evaluating individual teachers. This is simply understanding the cultural patterns of learning and teaching that dominate. So she played this information back to teachers without blame. She said, I'm observing a couple of things here. I'm observing that, most of us are asking kind of guess what's on my mind questions, true, false questions, factual answer questions, and we're not really giving many kids opportunities to kind of think about the questions before we move on. They didn't disagree with that. They kind of knew that. So she then engaged in the development of workshops, peer learning, to better understand what does a good question look like? What does a non-sort of factual recall, guess what's on my mind question look like? What's the difference between an open-ended and a closed question? And then she went back to that good old-fashioned thing we talked about yesterday called wait time, right? How long do you wait before you call on somebody? Or maybe you don't wait for a hand to go up. You call on somebody in the back who's been quiet for part of the period. They have the opportunity to pass, of course, meaning to say, I'm not sure, I don't know. So she just engaged in this intensive kind of conversation, professional conversation about quality of questions. Then she went back and started observing again. Because it's one thing to design an intervention over a period of time, but how do you know if it's working? Well, the only way she could know is she went back and started observing the same classes. And lo and behold, she saw some significant changes in the kinds of interactions she saw in classrooms. Now, to do that, she had to take a risk. And this is where it gets hard, isn't it? How would she know that improving the quality of questions being asked and the amount of time that kids have to think about those questions would lead to better learning? You have to have a theory of change. Her theory of change is that critical thinking begins with asking really good questions. And a teacher has to model that for students to learn that. And critical thinking and communication are the two most important skills that are being demanded in any domain in the 21st century. So implied in what I just talked about was the idea of not asking teachers to solve this problem by themselves. A superintendent friend of mine once said, isolation is the enemy of innovation. Isolation is the enemy of improvement. And that's ultimately one of the biggest reasons for risk aversion in our culture. It's because we work alone all day, every day. Most of us. There are exceptions. And working alone, we don't get feedback. Working alone, we don't have a way to test an idea out with somebody. So the vehicle for change, once you've created the problem, once you've raised the questions of the issues, you create a sense of urgency, you have to create communities of practice. You have to create time for teams of educators to work and talk together. And that's very hard. I know that. Logistically, it's really hard. How do you carve that time out? Where does it come from? You start later in the school day? I don't know. You've got, maybe that's something you talk to your peers here about. How do you make time, an hour a week, for communities of practice, peers solving problems of practice? There's a wonderful book by Stigler and Hibert called The Teaching Gap. Highly recommend it. They studied math instruction in 3 countries, US, Germany, and Japan, and discovered the Japanese students were many, many years ahead of comparably aged students in other countries. Tried to figure out why, and they found it. In Japan, teachers work together to identify a learning problem in math, say how to teach multiplication. They sit down and they work together to jointly design a new sequence of lessons. Then they watch each other teach those lessons and continuously improve and refine them. That's an example of how a community of practice improves instruction through peer supervision and peer leadership. We talk a lot about evaluation. We spend, I think, an inordinate amount of time on formal evaluations in classrooms. I really, in most places, do not see that they do a darn bit of good. Maybe they weed out the worst 5%. Could have been done probably more easily by other means. We don't talk enough about improving lessons. And here's the distinction. If you are evaluating me as a teacher, I feel you're evaluating my worth as a human being, my very essence. Do I want to be evaluated like that? Heck no. But now ask me a different question. Ask me if I've ever taught a perfect lesson. How many of you have ever taught a perfect lesson? None of us. We know that. How many of you might like feedback, non-judgmental, just some feedback on a lesson? And in turn, I'll give you an opportunity to give me feedback on my lesson. Lesson study, as the Japanese developed it, and as I'm describing it, is a far more effective engine for improving instruction than formal evaluation, in my experience. Not to say, of course you have to do formal evaluation. I know that. That's not the point. But don't assume or pretend that those kinds of more formal checklist-style evaluations are likely to improve lessons. It's lesson study that the Japanese developed. That's the methodology. You can Google it. It's lesson study that we need in every school. Communities of practice working together to solve problems of practice, which generates a completely different kind of accountability. You know, we talk about top-down accountability, which is always one way. Top-down, buy-in, mandate. There's another, and that generates compliance. Generates compliance from kids. Teachers say, do it because I told you to. Compliance is the minimum. Generates compliance from teachers. Yeah, all right, whatever. Generates compliance from schools. Doesn't generate change. It's a necessary form of accountability, but it's minimal and not a generator of real change. What is what I call face-to-face reciprocal relational accountability. We're a team. We're in this together. We've got this problem we have to solve together. And we're going to have to collectively get better together. And we're going to have to make our teaching and our learning much more transparent. That high-tech high school you saw in the video yesterday, guess what? First of all, every class is team taught for a reason. Can't hide bad teaching. Talked to Larry Rosenstock, the founder of that school. He said you could take away everything else that he has done, but he could not have succeeded without team teaching. Now, I know you can't probably do that in many of your settings, but we have to then find the ways to create the next best thing. Communities of practice, solving problems of practice. The other thing they did in that school, which was a rehabbed military base, by the way, was make sure that at least one classroom wall was all glass. Every classroom wall. Every classroom had one glass wall. No hiding. Reciprocal, relational, face-to-face accountability. Can't hide bad teaching in buildings like that, especially when you're doing learning walks. Big difference between a learning walk and a drive-by. I'll tell another anecdote. Love these stories. So I was working with a superintendent, and he was going to do, but he called them, he didn't call them learning walks. He called them walkthroughs, right? Every Tuesday he's going to do a walkthrough of a school, right? Look, randomly drop into classes. And he called it Super Tuesday, because every Tuesday he's going to be in classrooms all day long. Well, very quickly teachers came up with a nickname for his Tuesdays. It wasn't super at all. They called it Snooper Tuesdays. And I said, you got a problem. And I picked this up and reported back to him. So he agreed he had a problem. I said, why don't you just change what you tell folks you're looking for and ask them to invite you. Say you want to see evidence of interesting, innovative, and different approaches to learning. And you'd like to be invited to come to classrooms on Tuesdays to look for that. And when you find it, you're going to write about it and describe it in your newsletter. Totally changed the nature of the conversation. He got so many invitations to come in, he had to expand his Tuesdays into Wednesday. Nice problem to have. So there's a lot of talk about walkthroughs. Teachers hear that and think drive-bys. But if you instead talk about learning walks, you are learning how to observe lessons and give feedback. You are learning about the challenges teachers face in their classrooms. You're not there as a game of gotcha. And the value of a learning walk is multiplied 10x if you don't do it by yourself. Tell another story. I worked with 3 primary principals in Hawaii, 4 primary principals over a period of 3 days. And I began the workshop with a videotape of a lesson. Asked them, was this a good lesson? Don't evaluate the teacher. I'm not asking that question. Was it a good lesson? Give it a grade. We, of course, don't normally do that. Grade range was A to F among these 4 teachers. No agreement. They're working in the same kind of small geographic area with the same kids. No agreement about what was a good lesson. So we talked. But, well, how do you look for goodness in a lesson? What do you look for? I'm going to come to that in a moment. But I'm more describing now the nature of the process. So we agreed on some criteria, and it's not a long checklist. Basically decided to look for rigor and relevance. Talk more about that in a moment. But I said, all right, when you go into a classroom, you can spend 3, 4, 5 minutes observing, just on a scale of 1 to 4. How much rigor? How much engagement? It wasn't relevance, it was engagement. How much engagement do you see? And quickly make notes of evidence. So the 4 principals did this together for 2.5 days. And we would spend as much time debriefing the lessons we had just seen together as we had spent actually observing lessons. So a couple hours debriefing the 6 or 8 lessons we'd seen. Because the idea was to get what researchers call inter-rater reliability. You know what I mean? Consistency. Do we see the same things? Because I can tell you over and over again, I've worked with administrators from the same building who have radically different views of the lesson they just saw. Totally different. Well, how are you going to improve learning in that school if you don't agree on what good learning looks like? So these principals spent 2.5 days doing this. And their differences went from here to here to here to here in 2.5 days. Of the 2.5 days spent merely looking at lessons together with a common criteria and then talking about them. So to me, the moral of the story is do learning walks, but if you can possibly do them with a colleague, do them together. Done this in other schools where teachers kind of got wind of what was going on and say, just, you know, I've never had a chance to observe my colleagues. Please, can I go on a learning walk? I don't know what other people are doing around here. I have no clue. So we set up learning walks for teachers, just to know what's going on, just to have a chance to observe others. Prioritize, that's obvious. I said it already. The principal or the school that has 10 priorities has none. And that's maybe one of the worst things that government does to us, isn't it? We'll come back to that question in a moment. Prioritize. District 2 in New York City, and I know there's been this will generate a kind of a bad taste here because your national government did this to you. But at the local level, this district said, you know, if kids can't read, they can't do science, they can't do math, they can't do anything. So we're going to focus for the next period of time as a school, as a district or group of schools, on how do we improve reading instruction? How do we improve our lessons in reading? They brought in coaches, I think from Australia or New Zealand, I'm not sure. They brought in literacy coaches. And they worked over and over a period of several years on how to improve reading lessons. They went from the very bottom of a sort of number of districts to the very top in 2 years. Having then developed the confidence and the competence, they then turned to math. Now, I'm not saying this is what you should do, and I realize the national government may have said some version of this that was a serious failure because it implied that nothing else was important. But you know, if you have reading across the curriculum, you have it in the arts. It's not to say that you diminish other subjects, and they didn't. But it is to say reading does come first, after all. So prioritization is crucial. And that, obviously, as someone already said, sticking to that priority. Focus and finish. Don't have a new priority every year. That doesn't work. Focus and finish. Incent innovation. Well, when you went from Snooper Tuesday to Super Tuesday, in a sense, that principal, that superintendent, was incenting innovation. He was saying, invite me to lessons where you're trying something new and different. I'm curious to see them. So, you can do the same. But you can also, after you've sort of helped your communities understand this changing world and what it's going to demand of kids in terms of new skills, you can say, all right, I'm going to have a little pot of money. Probably won't be much, but it's going to be my innovation fund. And I'm going to invite teams of teachers to apply, maybe to create an interdisciplinary curriculum, maybe to create evening exhibitions of mastery, like the one you saw in the video, or digital portfolios as a new form of assessment. But you want to incent innovation, which invariably means you're giving teachers permission to do trial and error. You're giving them a safety net when you're incenting innovation. You're not expecting it to be perfect. But here's the deal. I mean, teachers say this to me all the time. You know, I'm afraid of trying something new because I'm afraid I will fail. Well, we talked about that yesterday. You create a system of failure in schools, and that's all people can think about. But if you have a community of practice who has done its research, a team of teachers, not an individual, a team of teachers who's done its research, then you can't fail. You may not be perfect the first time out, but what we already have is a failure, you see, in our current system. So you're talking about making serious, disciplined efforts to improve on what we already have. And if it's research-based, meaning you really looked at the evidence, and it's team-based, meaning you vetted your ideas with a team, it's not ever going to be a failure. Let's get the F word out of schools. It's paralyzing. Paralyzing for adults, paralyzing for kids. Don't allow the F word to be used in your schools, because it will kill innovation. It will kill curiosity. All right, let me tell you what I've already just heard. I was called over to a couple of tables, and the first thing I heard is that you are time poor. That you may indeed have more structures that enable degrees of collaboration among teachers, but you have no collaborative planning time during the school day. Huge, huge issue. Deborah Meyer, one of the most innovative principals I've ever known, working in a very, very poor district in Harlem in New York, said, all right, I'm going to send kids out of the building half a day to do community service or work-based internships. They were older kids. She could do that. That half day, she thought, was a little bit of a throwaway. It was a 2-for-1. She got kids so engaged in their community-based learning that she saw enormous changes, and she gave teachers a half a day of planning time. That's how we have to get creative. I don't know. I don't have the answers. I don't. You do. But I agree that's the right question. And I will say it to the ministries. Second thing I heard today is that you're being evaluated on acceleration of priority learners. Do I have that right? And that the problem is that the definition of what is improvement in a priority learner is so limiting, you're not really being able to attend to other things that matter, that make a difference in kids' lives and well-being, like the arts or like exercise. Correct? Do I have that problem right? See, I've got to check here. If I don't have it right. So, give you a little data point here. It's kind of fun. I tweet out interesting articles or research when I find them. Dr. Tony Wagner, if you're interested. I found one yesterday. Newest research around exercise and brain function. Brand new piece of research out yesterday. Even 10 minutes of very small amounts of exercise significantly improve brain function immediately afterwards. Immediately. Now, Finland has known this for 35 years because they have 15 minutes of recess after every hour of class. Interesting, isn't it? So this is the kind of thing we don't even think about or know about in terms of acceleration of priority learners. Give them more recess. It's counterintuitive. But I get the point. All right, so I got 2 biggies here. I need some more. What else? Higher priorities of things. Please raise your hands. The mic will come to you. Other biggies that I need to know.
Hi, Tony. My name's Fiona, and I'm the president of the International Confederation of Principals. So I see a lot of different things around the world, a bit like you do. And one of the things, and you just mentioned Finland, but one of the things that I see, and what takes a lot of courage for governments, is the re-imaging of teachers and leaders and schools as places that are positive, rather than always reaching the headlines as negative.
Yeah.
Because the
I think it's
majority
huge.
of our business is positive, and it is only a fraction that is negative, although that might take up all our time on a given day. But it is, the majority of what we do is positive, but the message about our profession is negative.
Yeah.
And we have to change that.
Yeah.
We, meaning all of us in this room, the next time you go to a barbecue, make sure you're talking up your job and
Yeah.
down your job.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
Agreed. Well said. That is, of course, what Finland did. They completely transformed the nature of the teaching profession and how it is perceived right now. It is the most desired job in Finland, not by any means the highest paying, but it is the highest status job in the country.
And New Zealand is a small country.
And it's a small and relatively poor country, not a hugely wealthy country. Yes?
The other thing that we've talked about today is collaboration, supporting each other to make a difference. You talked about who do you call? Well, actually, there isn't anybody. You're quite right.
I know.
So putting value in mentoring and coaching for leaders and teachers, to me, is huge.
Yeah. Yep. Makes complete sense. Let me get back to the re-imaging of teaching for a minute. Forgive me because I'm ignorant, but teachers get tenure here, is that right?
No.
Do most of your teachers have tenure? No? Some. Most do, right? Frankly, I'll be very honest with you. I'm a big fan of unions. I was a member of my union when I was a teacher. I have high regard for union leadership, but I'm worried that our protection of our tenure system is part of our problem. Who else in the world has tenure? Who else has a job for life? That's how outsiders see us. And when they hear us objecting to accountability measures, and again, I'm the biggest critic of the current accountability measures being used, but when the public hears that, they may hear us saying, we don't want to be accountable. So I have a suggestion. I recommend you get some buttons printed up. And it simply says, hold me accountable for what matters most. You want to be held accountable because you're professionals, but you want to be held accountable for the right things. That's what I just heard at this table. Not whether or not there's been a 1% improvement in a certain test in a given year, but whether or not your kids are leaving your school ready for the next level as whole children. So that's the conversation we need to have. That's the barbecue conversation. Get people asking, what does that button mean? What would a better kind of accountability look like? That's what our professional associations need to advocate, a better assessment and accountability system. Across the world, I see that. Yes, please.
Kia ora, Tony. We talked about alignment and the importance of the same message from the minister, the ministry, Aero and school, so that parents and the wider community are hearing those same messages from everybody.
Now, give me an example of a problem of misalignment today, please.
I think it's more what it has been. I think we're certainly heading in that right direction, but all the things that we're talking about at this conference in terms of creativity and innovation, that everybody's valuing that.
Got it. I mean, it's really having a countrywide priority, isn't it? As opposed to 20 or 50 competing priorities. Each sub-ministry or minister having a different priority. Yeah, completely agree. Yes, please.
Oh, hi, Tony. Thinking about that evidence, not just data, so at that national level, the ministry being courageous in thinking about evidence of effective practice in schools, not just about achievement data.
Yeah. You know, in many countries, they have folks that do, teams that do school visits as a part of their accountability system. They're talking to kids, they're talking to parents, they're visiting classes. They're not just looking at a data point. They're looking at the culture of a school. Do you have that? But they're looking at the data when they're in the school, not at the school. Okay.
Kia ora, Tony. Whetu here. In a number of documents I've seen over the last few months, cabinet papers, etc., the Minister talks about our young people need to be creative, adaptable, flexible, resilient, te mea. He missed an opportunity the other day. He didn't actually focus on creativity. And I'm wondering if you could remind him about that.
So what did he miss again? Tell me what he did and what he should have done. One more time, please.
Okay, I spoke, he responded. There was some stuff around what's happening with our industrial stuff. He's talking about all the great things they've done. They've taken away national standards, charter schools, and so on and so on. But within the cabinet paper on the workforce strategy, it's clearly right in there. We need adaptable, creative, resilient, help me Linda, flexible, young people, young learners, lifelong learners, innovation. He missed an opportunity the other day. I guess he's got a lot on it at the moment, so it'd be great for you to remind him about creativity. Thank you.
Yep. So again, it's one thing to write a nice, pretty sounding document. It's another thing to make it come to life. And when you make it come to life, it's what you always talk about. It's not just one of 10 or 20 talking points. That's really your point, isn't it? What is it that truly matters here? What's important? That's the conversation. Yes, please.
Hi, Tony. Dennis, I'm president from Australia's Primary Principal Association. And I think one of the key messages that I think principals here would agree with is, which is you've been talking about, is the people who have the solutions are in this building today.
Exactly.
So working with the principals to make the change.
G'day, Tony. Perry Rush.
Where are you?
Hastings into me.
There you are.
System performance has under national standards, been measured by those standardised measures, and I think we're on the cusp of hopefully entering a new age. I think the question around how student achievement and system performance can be measured with complex and diverse measures of student achievement is really critical. We'd love our ministry to get that shift, and I think movement at ministry level is really critical. It has an impact on the Education Review Office and other system measures, and those need to be right, otherwise they push down into our schooling. So that's a really critical conversation.
So the question is, what are the right measures?
Yeah, what are those system measures, and how can they be made to be diverse and brave and different and reflect the diversity of our students?
Okay. The challenge I see everywhere, all over the world, is that we're measuring what's easy to measure, not necessarily what's truly important. I mean, it's that simple. We're relying on computers and tests to measure things that are comparatively easy to measure. But they don't necessarily tell you. There is recent research. You know, we've been at this in the United States for 25 years. I'm not kidding. No Child Left Behind started a little after the year 2000. This year. And the most recent research is that there's absolutely no correlation between higher test scores and attainment later in life. Zero. That low test scores don't predict low attainment in life, and that high test scores don't predict higher attainment in life. And this is a really tough pill for these education reformers who've been at this for 2 decades to swallow. But that's the latest research. And that's no surprise. You know that. We know that. We've seen kids, you're looking at one of them, who had lousy test scores, but managed to kind of eke out a reasonable attainment in life. We know lots of kids like that, lots of adults like that. So that's really what we're talking about. Stop measuring what's easy to measure. Start talking about what's important. And the other thing, let's talk about poverty, guys. When we talk about kids, what was the term used that I was given a minute ago? It was so clear. The priority learners. Kids from poverty is what we're talking about. We don't want to talk about poverty. Why? We think teachers are to blame? We think teachers are going to fix poverty? That's where the real neck comes, the chop comes down on our necks. They're telling us we got to fix the problem. Kids are growing up in poverty. I'm not saying that's an excuse. Don't misunderstand me. Not for 1 second should that ever be used as an excuse. But I'm saying ameliorating poverty has to be one of the solutions. It's not just our problem to solve. And then when we say, hold me accountable for what matters most, we need to include that. Let's all be accountable. It's a community problem. It's a country, national problem. It is not just an education problem. Poverty and low achievement rates tend to go hand in hand across the world. But we don't want to talk about that in most countries. I think we got a couple minutes left. Are there important lessons that I've not yet heard? Did you?
Yeah, we talk a lot about learner agency, student agency. I think the government need to give teachers and leaders agency and allow us to do our job and get their hands off and stop meddling so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kia ora, Tony. Sorry,
Yes, go ahead.
Brain fade there. Jess Ward, Parapara Umu Beach Primary. I think I'd really like you to remind the Minister that we need time to lead. The Ministry's often talking about we are the leaders of learning in our school. I'd love to be the leader of learning. I'm not. I'm the leader of property, finance, health and safety,
Yeah, right.
HR, and I'm desperate to be the leader of learning. So we need time to lead. What that looks like might be, someone else helping out with property and finance. Or a release teacher, an extra release teacher for every school. So we can do the walk rounds. We can release more teachers to have conversations about improving learning. And that's my message. Just we need time to learn. Thank you. Time to lead.
Yeah, amen. I know some schools that have experimented with putting business managers in offices with principals to solve exactly that problem. Right? All right, we've got one more here.
Kia ora, Tony. One thing that's interesting is we've been talking about this for 20 minutes and no one's mentioned pay. And I think that's probably the public perceived that teachers are complaining because they're not paid enough.
Yeah.
The strong message is, yes, increase the pay, but these other things are really, really important. And stop focusing on we're giving them a 16% or a 10% pay rise. It's not about that. It's far deeper than that.
I think that's wonderful. It's a great ending point. Here I've had these 2 sessions with you. You've had all these opportunities to raise questions, raise concerns, talk about needs and priorities. Not one person has mentioned more money. That's powerful. That's so powerful. Thank you. Thank you for this gift of time together. Thank you for your wonderful advice. I'll do the best I can. Can't promise, you know that, but I will try to be honest to what you've said to me today and what I've learned from you. So thank you very much.